What's good? It's Woog. This is a legacy-defining opportunity for two former champions. We have David Benavidez, 26 wins and 0 losses, taking on Caleb Plant, 22 wins and 1 loss. That 1 loss is to Canelo in November of 2021. And both of these guys not only stand so much to gain legacy-wise with the win over the other, but they both want to get Canelo in the ring. Caleb Plant would obviously love to have another crack at the great Canelo, and David Benavidez has been trying to get Canelo in the ring ever since Canelo stormed the gates at 168, shortly after David Benavidez no longer held his 2-time earned WBC 168-pound title. He lost it the first time due to recreational cocaine use, essentially, and he lost it the second time by missing weight in his title defense against Romer Alexis Angulo. And with David Benavidez versus Caleb Plant, I've been thinking about this one so much. This is a fantastic matchup. It's one of the most anticipated and best fights on the boxing calendar. And you know, for over a year, I was skeptical on whether this fight would ever happen. You know how just based on the rhetoric coming from fighters and their just attitudes towards matchmaking, you kind of get an impression of who wants which fights and who really doesn't. For instance, I've always had the impression that Shakur Stevenson is down to pretty much fight anybody. You know, it's like Devin Haney, sure, you know, we'll get in the ring. Let's Gervonta Davis, sure, let's do it. I mean, those fights haven't happened yet, but it doesn't seem like it's because of Shakur Stevenson not wanting the fight to happen. I mean, Vasily Lomachenko, yeah, I want Vasily Lomachenko. When Stevenson was down at 130, Oscar Valdez, sure, let's make that unification fight against Oscar Valdez. I've also thought that David Benavidez wants to smoke with just about anybody. And maybe it is because he is, although he's a 2-time belt holder, he still hasn't broken through as a superstar fighter yet. He hasn't been headlining pay-per-views or anything like that. He's been a quality fighter who's been on a lot of people's radars for a few years now, especially with his big win over Anthony Dirrell in 2019 on the Errol Spence Jr. versus Sean Porter undercard. But when you hear other fighters talking about him, like from Mike Tyson, who coined him the Mexican Monster, to other trainers who've been long saying that they would take David Benavidez over, you know, some of his contemporaries. I think it was maybe Abel Sanchez, Triple G's former trainer and, you know, longtime trainer of several great fighters, has said that he would take David Benavidez over Canelo Alvarez. Let me know if I'm wrong on that one, but I believe that's what Abel Sanchez said. So David Benavidez has kind of been a lot of, you know, your favorite fighters' favorite fighter, right? He's one of those guys who people have wanted to see get some of these big opportunities, but it was Caleb Plant who hit the Canelo sweepstakes, who won the lottery essentially by still having that IBF belt after 3 pretty lousy title defenses in terms of opponent quality, after Caleb Plant pretty much captured the boxing world's imagination after those back-to-back wins over Rogelio Porky Medina, and then in his title win where he earned the title against Jose Uzcategui. Caleb Plant was somebody who was like, man, this guy looks like he's got a lot of the tools. Sweet hands, has fast hands. He's got great ring generalship. He's good at slipping punches. Yeah, he does tend to fatigue late in fights, it appears. But yeah, Caleb Plant seems to be the genuine article. But then when we saw him with 3 title defenses over Mike Lee, Vincent Feigenbutz, and then an aging, or I believe 40-year-old Caleb Truax, it was kind of like, what the hell, Caleb Plant? I feel like a lot of the goodwill that he had built with the boxing public was starting to fade because it became abundantly clear he was just holding on to that IBF belt for dear life so he could get that Canelo fight, basically playing it safe so he could score the big payday, which I don't knock him for, but as a boxing fan, you just wanted to see Caleb Plant fighting, you know, Billy Joe Saunders at the time, Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez, who just missed weight against Gabriel Rosado, but this is when Gilberto Ramirez was still a belt holder at 168, and you wanted Caleb Plant to fight David Benavidez. Again, this is before Canelo stormed the gates and beat Callum Smith, another guy who I would have loved to have seen fight Caleb Plant, but Canelo stormed the gates fighting Callum Smith, Avni Yildirim, kind of in an in-between fight 3 months after the Smith fight, and then Billy Joe Saunders, Caleb Plant, to become undisputed champion at 168. So as I'm looking at David Benavidez versus Caleb Plant, you look at the betting odds and it's like David Benavidez is a greater than like 2.5 to 1 favorite. And when this fight was made, it's almost like the boxing world said, yeah, Caleb Plant, you can run, but you can't hide. But to me, that was until Caleb Plant's win over Anthony Dirrell. Now, granted, this wasn't the same Anthony Dirrell who had fought David Benavidez in 2019. I think that 3 years makes a big difference in a fighter who was 35 years old against David Benavidez and then 38 years old against Caleb Plant. But the way that he won that fight, he was winning competitive, but I thought somewhat clear rounds against Anthony Dirrell, and then he landed probably the best punch of his career thus far. I mean, he's had some nice knockouts. I thought Caleb Plant's knockout over Mike Lee was good, but Mike Lee's not Anthony Dirrell. So when he threw that double hook, the first to the body and then up top, where Anthony Dirrell was totally unguarded in the 9th round and basically put him to sleep and then demonstratively celebrated with, you know, the shovel digging dirt and throwing it on top of Anthony Dirrell, which was in poor taste at the time, but this was a bad blood fight going into it. That kind of changed the narrative on Caleb Plant, who, in my view, and in online boxing analyst Richard Dwyer's view, had become increasingly lead hand heavy, left lead hand heavy, where he wasn't really letting his right hand go, and some suspected that he had some sort of an arm or hand injury that kept him from using his right hand frequently and reliably. And if you look at Caleb Plant's fight against Caleb Truax, I think you see a lot of that. It's like, damn, why is he so jab heavy and not really letting the right hand go? But he started to deploy the right hand a lot more against Anthony Dirrell. And I looked at that as being a promising sign for Caleb Plant going forward, because if he's a two-fisted Caleb Plant, obviously that's a lot more dangerous than a one-fisted Caleb Plant. If you're a one-handed Caleb Plant, yes, it's going to be a, yeah, you can run, but you can't hide against a guy like David Benavidez, who's going to kind of patiently walk you down and start turning up the temperature round over round over round. Now, if we look at David Benavidez, yes, he has been walking his opponents down. He's been knocking most of his opponents out. 23 of his 26 wins have come via knockout. He stopped Anthony Dirrell, by the way, in September of 2019, and he stopped Romer Angulo, who went the distance against Edgar Berlanga. And then most recently, he stopped Ronald Ellis, Kyron Davis, and then David Lemieux. And this was David Lemieux's final fight. And David Lemieux shouldn't have really ever been up at 168. He was a knockout artist at 160, but David Lemieux won a shorter fighter who's then going up to fight David Benavidez, but it was also an aging David Lemieux. So he fought valiantly, but he pretty much got obliterated and stopped in the 3rd round. So with David Benavidez, it was those back-to-back fights against Ronald Gavril, where Gavril dropped him towards the end of the first fight, which resulted in a split decision win for David Benavidez, and then they ran it back right after that, and then David Benavidez won a unanimous decision over Ronald Gavril. And those two fights were right after David Benavidez, his kind of his coming out party against Rogelio Porky Medina. So David Benavidez and Caleb Plant have two, or at least two, common opponents between them in Porky Medina and then Anthony Dirrell. But David Benavidez has never fought a fighter like Caleb Plant, and I feel like that's what the public's missing. Yes, we do see those attributes. David Benavidez hits hard, he hits often, he appears to have a very good chin, even though he has been dropped, and I thought that he got caught cleanly against Anthony Dirrell, and we're going to revisit that one in a sec. But he seems to have a pretty good chin. Again, good punching power, good hand speed, long arms, and better defense than advertised. He's not just a brute who's coming forward and willing to just get hit by 1,000 punches so he could get his off. No, he's not Antonio Margarito in that regard. He's got pretty good defense. He's got decent head movement, pretty good head movement, but I mean, sometimes he fights a little too tall. And I mean, I've heard Joe Goosen point that out in past David Benavidez fights, but sometimes he'll keep the high guard. Sometimes he'll kind of keep his hands right around chest level or even near belly level, which you can't really do too much against Caleb Plant, because unlike Kyron Davis, unlike Jalen Love, unlike David Lemieux, Caleb Plant is about 6 feet, 6'1". And here's one of the tricky things when analyzing this Benavidez versus Plant fight. If you look at their Wikipedias or their box recs, David Benavidez is listed at like 1 inch taller than Caleb Plant. But I feel like if you know, in the face-offs that we've seen, for instance, it looks like there's at least a 2-inch height advantage, right? But if you look at their measurables, it's a 1-inch height advantage. And even more surprisingly than that, there's like a 1/2 inch reach advantage. I'm talking 74.5 inches for David Benavidez, which is only a 1/2 inch longer than Terrence Crawford's reach on paper. And Terrence Crawford has an unbelievably long reach, 2 inches longer than Errol Spence and Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s reaches. And keep in mind, they all fight at 147. But David Benavidez on paper has a 74.5-inch reach to Caleb Plant's 74-inch reach. If these things were true in terms of the near even height and the near even reach, I would actually say David Benavidez is going to have his hands full. And I do have reason to believe that he will have his hands full, even though he's again a big betting favorite, which I don't understand. That I feel like some of these narratives and assumptions that the boxing public has amongst itself on social media and so forth play into these weird betting odds between Benavidez and Plant. It's Plant who has gone 11 rounds with Canelo Alvarez. And yes, some people think Benavidez would beat Alvarez. I'm just saying, how we can't assume that until we see that. Or at least see David Benavidez beat somebody who's like elite or near elite. And yes, he has beaten Anthony Dirrell, but we just haven't seen Benavidez against enough of the best fighters. And if you look at David Benavidez versus Anthony Dirrell, look through the first 5 rounds. I feel like there's almost like a public forgetfulness over how some of these fights take place. I'm going to quote the great online boxing analyst Richard Dwyer once more: knockouts cause amnesia. So the fact that David Benavidez stopped Anthony Dirrell in 2019 almost has you forget what the early to middle rounds were looking like. Now, in the first 5 rounds, you know, Joe Goosen is pretty much applauding how well Anthony Dirrell is doing. And the unofficial scorecard has it 3-2, David Benavidez. So it's a competitive fight. Anthony Dirrell caught David Benavidez with a couple nice hooks up top where it kind of stopped Benavidez in his tracks and got one of those smiles, awkward smiles. It was one of those, yeah, that buzzed me a bit type of smile from David Benavidez. And so they were, you know, whacking each other to the body up top. And David Benavidez looked like he was kind of struggling to get in closer to Anthony Dirrell so then he could start letting his hands go. Keep in mind, David Benavidez, again, turns the temperature up round over round over round. But it was a close fight through 5 rounds. It wasn't until the 6th round that Benavidez opened up a cut on Anthony Dirrell. Bad cut over the eyes. They thought that they might stop it right then and there in the 6th round, where the ref stops it like halfway into the round, you know, kind of takes Anthony Dirrell by the wrist, walks him over and looks at the doctor immediately. And then they let the fight continue for another, you know, couple of rounds, and it was stopped in the 9th round. But through 5, it was anybody's guess who was going to come out on top between Benavidez and Dirrell. So when Dirrell was still somewhat fresh and still sharp, he was hanging with David Benavidez. And I would go as far as to say he did better through the first 5 rounds against Benavidez than he did against Caleb Plant. Again, it was a 3-year difference, 35 years old versus 38 years old. But Caleb Plant will be the sharpest boxer David Benavidez has fought. And again, David Benavidez does get hit. He's not a perfect fighter. He's a very good pressuring and eventually obliterating fighter, but it takes him some time sometimes to get cooking before you start seeing him flash his fast hands. And, you know, he's one of these guys who, like, you know, Tim Tszyu, who we just saw, is able to eventually get his opponents back against the ropes to where the opponent is more and more vulnerable, and then he starts letting his power punches go. I'm just wondering how and how long it's going to take David Benavidez to get Caleb Plant to start sitting on the ropes more and more. I think that in the first few rounds, we might see Caleb Plant just boxing David Benavidez's ears off, so to speak. Now, Benavidez does have that long jab that he uses to get in range. So he'll kind of sit outside and then just throw that long jab. And then before you know it, he's in striking distance again. And it's up to the opponent to start moving laterally so he's not standing right in front of David Benavidez. I think that Caleb Plant is going to have the snappier punches, especially especially in the early rounds. So David Benavidez, I don't know if that long pummeling jab is going to be enough to just get in range and start working Caleb Plant over. I think that you've got to worry about Caleb Plant's jab. You've got to worry about his left hook for damn sure. And again, David Benavidez gets caught with left hooks. Caleb Plant often ends fights with left hooks. That's something to think about. And again, if Caleb Plant is getting increasingly comfortable throwing that right hand frequently, David Benavidez might have his hands full. Now, in the whole lead up here, I've been thinking David Benavidez via late stoppage. That's kind of what I'm assuming most of y'all are thinking as well. David Benavidez via late stoppage, where Caleb Plant might win some early rounds, might even win some middle rounds, but will eventually tire, get worked over. David Benavidez is going to get cooking. Caleb Plant is going to start running and start trying to hold and buy time because the pace is going to start becoming overwhelming. And then Caleb Plant will eventually get stopped. I'm thinking that that's what most are believing. And yeah, for most of this lead up to this video, I've been thinking much of the same. I'm just wondering, what if Caleb Plant's underrated punching power is the X factor here that we aren't considering? Basically, what happens if Caleb Plant is able to hurt David Benavidez and David Benavidez isn't able to take Caleb Plant's punches like he's able to take his other opponent's punches and pretty much walk through it and keep on coming down and beating them up? What if this is the type of power where when Caleb Plant lands, he gets David Benavidez's respect, and so then when Caleb Plant starts feinting, he starts getting a reaction from David Benavidez, and David Benavidez isn't able to just walk him down as comfortably and as, monstrously as he's able to walk down his other opponents. Like, Caleb Plant is nothing like a lot of these guys that David Benavidez has been fighting, and that cannot be overlooked here. I think both of these guys are super highly motivated. I feel like David Benavidez has been champing at the bit to get this opportunity to make his statement. If he hadn't already with that win over Anthony Dirrell, I feel like enough time has passed where it's like, yeah, David Benavidez needs to reintroduce himself to the casual boxing public and get on Canelo's radar, where yes, Canelo looks like he's gonna have his calendar more or less already worked out with this John Ryder fight, and then probably with the Dimitri Bivol fight, I'm guessing in the second half of 2023. But after that, you would think that a win over Caleb Plant would get David Benavidez that shot against Canelo. We'll see what the sanctioning bodies do and whether they mandate that the winner of this becomes a Canelo Alvarez mandatory, which in that case, you might see Canelo just drop his belt if fighting Dimitri Bivol is more important than defending his undisputed status against the winner of Benavidez versus Caleb Plant. But yeah, both of these guys, Benavidez and Plant, desperately want to win this fight, I believe. And you throw in the fact that this is a grudge match as well. Again, I'm just not so sure about this Benavidez via late stoppage proposition. But you know what? Man, it's almost tough to say does David Benavidez win this fight if it's not a stoppage? Can he win more rounds than Caleb Plant? That's starting to be where I lean. I mean, in recent days, and to be honest with you, in recent hours, I've been a little bit more back and forth where I can see Caleb Plant winning via decision. I can see Caleb Plant potentially stopping David Benavidez. Yes, this can happen if the hand speed and the power and just the boxing IQ and boxing ability ends up being, this is too much for David Benavidez. This type of thing has happened before. But I do think that David Benavidez is going to dig deep. I think he's going to have to dig deep. I think Caleb Plant's going to have to dig deep. But I think that David Benavidez will start applying that pressure to where you see, I don't know if he's going to open up a cut on Caleb Plant, which can, change how the fight looks and how the fight feels. I don't know if it's going to be a knockdown or two. And yes, I could see Caleb Plant knocking David Benavidez down, but I feel like David Benavidez is either going to cut Caleb Plant or he's going to drop Caleb Plant. And then that's going to play into the scorecards as we get into the championship rounds. I think Caleb Plant is going to fight valiantly, but I think that this will ultimately kind of take on a Jarrett Hurd versus Erislandy Lara type of finish, where David Benavidez might even get a late knockdown of Caleb Plant, where Caleb Plant is kind of having to hold on a bit and survive the end of the fight to make this a 12-round distance fight. So I think this is gonna be a very competitive fight. I think that we will see David Benavidez get hit, not only with punches, because he gets hit with punches, again, frequently, but he's gonna get hit with hard punches that he does not want to get hit with. I think that we'll see more of that in this fight. But I think that David Benavidez will win the fight, and I think that he's going to score at least a knockdown of Caleb Plant. I think that it's likely that there will be blood in this fight, probably more blood coming from Caleb Plant. And I actually think that David Benavidez is going to win, but via decision and not via stoppage. So I'm going to take David Benavidez to beat Caleb Plant via, it might be a unanimous decision. It might even be a split decision. I do think that this is going to be a very competitive fight. It's going to be David Benavidez who's going to have to start doing something to start demonstratively winning rounds. Because again, I think Caleb Plant is going to be the one who has the early round success in this one. Again, I think he's going to be the snappier puncher between the two. But yeah, I'm taking Benavidez via decision. And it did take a lot of overthinking to arrive here. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are on, again, one of the most anticipated and one of the best matchups on the boxing calendar between David Benavidez and Caleb Plant, two former champions who I'm just glad that this fight got made. They started to hint towards it, and then they started to announce that it had been agreed upon, finalized, you know, all those words that we get before it's official. But then when it sounded like it was about to be official. So we've been waiting for this one for some time, and I'm just glad that we're getting it. But let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.